Okay, Adam, do you think we're good to?
I think so. We've got 50 people here and they'll be coming in as you're beginning.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming along. As you presumably know, if you're here, unless you're on a sort of crazy voyage around online events, we're here to talk about the Wave 5 findings from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is an online survey that we at the Audience Agency have been carrying out for just over the last year. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight here at the Audience Agency. And so I'll be sharing just some of the findings we've got from this latest and indeed last wave of the Cultural Participation Monitor in its current form, with a bit of room towards the end of the conversation for us to sort of share experiences, or if you want to ask any questions or anything, you would be very welcome. As you'll see by the huge number of logos here on the front screen, this was very much a collaborative project, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So it was part of a kind of large-scale academic project. So we were the kind of non-academic partner, given our background in doing lots of quantitative research. But there are a wide range of other elements to the project, which hopefully it will allow me to advance my slides. And that included a wide range of looks on the impact of COVID, both in terms of the workforce and the wider impact on sort of what ecosystems, for example, looking across Greater Manchester, looking at different bits of the cultural sector. So a mixture of qualitative, quantitative, and other work. So by all means, do please look at the Centre for Cultural Value for wider pictures of the impact of COVID. But today we're going to be talking specifically about the public and how they have responded, what they've done. So in this piece of research, as some of you will know from previous renditions of these findings, we looked particularly at what people have done in terms of behaviours, both online, in person, and in terms of participatory activity. And we've looked at it in a series of waves since last October, roughly every 3 months. So we've also sort of turbocharged the first and the last of those waves in terms of the sample, to give us the opportunity for a more detailed look at the different breaks of the population. So this wave 5 really is our kind of most granular opportunity to look at engagers since we started out just over a year ago. Of course, at that point, we were already well into the COVID life, but that first wave picked up some of the back picture at that stage. So in this session, I'll also look at some of the kind of trends through COVID, now that we've got this kind of wider picture up to this point at least. Worth noting that it's a nationally representative survey, weighted in terms of a range of demographics and regions and so forth. So it does represent everybody, and therefore what people do across all the different types of activities. And because of the size of the sample, it allows us to have really quite good samples, even for relatively sort of minority activities. So we should have reasonably kind of quite good groups to look at. And we will continue to do reporting based off both this particular wave of data and indeed the whole of the monitor over the next several months. Although technically the research project finished 2 days ago, but nonetheless, the data never ends, don't worry. So just moving on then to flag some of the things we'll be talking about. I've mentioned the types of content that are in there, but also we've been looking at people's engagement before, during, and indeed looking towards the future, what people will be thinking of doing. And I'll say a little bit about that, that future intention, and whether what people are expecting to do today. There is a whole host of additional information on our website if you look at the audienceagency.org/evidence. And indeed, you can see some themes here on the right that we've kind of collated different content from the monitor under, and we will keep doing that. Let's go forward. And if there's particular questions you have for us, obviously ask them later in this session, but do also feel free to get in touch. The only other things to say by way of introduction, I think, is to note that there is live transcription. So if you want it, there's a live transcription button at the bottom with a CC written on it. Do feel free to put questions in the chat. My colleague Elise is here and we'll kind of keep track of things you've asked. Yeah, so Elise waving. But equally, we'll try and make time at the end for more of a discussion. The session's being recorded, so if you don't want to be seen on camera, do feel free to turn yours off. But if you could mute if you're not speaking, that would be great. But when we get to the discussion a bit later, we will kind of stop recording so that you can talk whilst knowing it's not going to be recorded for posterity. So, oops, beg your pardon. I missed this one. So what we're going to talk about in this session really is about people's engagement, how people are feeling about attendance and their attitudes to attending. What are the kind of factors that people really care about in terms of being willing to attend, but also then looking to the future in terms of whether people expect to attend more or less, or for which types of things, and so forth. So I just move over to this bit. So to situate where we are in the wider picture of COVID, of course, wave one, last October, November, we had seen this kind of big collapse in in-person attendance, driven by all the various lockdowns we had. There'd been brief windows where people could engage, but relatively scarce, only for certain art forms. So we'd seen a kind of really big contraction in in-person engagement, although, of course, people were still doing various other leisure activities. It's just that in-person arts and culture weren't available as much as part of that set. However, we can now see, if we look at the wave 5 data, that now the pandemic's run for a bit longer, lots of people have been back at least once to in-person arts and culture. Not quite the same proportion that would go in any typical year, but nonetheless, so quite a substantial retrenchment. And we'll see in a sec that that's really very much about this year rather than last year. Some art forms, particularly those with smaller smaller pockets of attenders, or maybe particularly loyal audience groups, may indeed have started to tip over that kind of proportion that would attend in a typical year. Things like contemporary dance, literary events are getting there. But notably, so the two art forms with really, really big drops, things like plays and musicals, where they're really having quite substantial decreases. Bearing in mind too that obviously those are, have relatively high fixed costs as activities as well. Where we see children, family, and panto is doing okay. That's particularly the children and family element of that, we think, and we have seen some delays on panto sales, which you may have seen us reference, both on the BBC as shown in the previous slide, but also various other kind of conversations in trade press. So our concern would be particularly outside of London that pantos, people would be a bit more reluctant about attending panto than ideally we'd like them to be in terms of panto sales. However, broadly speaking, a lot of people have been back to in-person arts and culture. Specifically, about 2/3 of people have been to something, at least during the pandemic, but that is mainly this year. So within 2020, within the pandemic, so not the first 10 weeks of the year, just over 1/3 of people had been to anything. In this year, almost 2/3, and that's pretty much the same proportion of people who have engaged at all across the whole pandemic period. And we can see, if we compare the proportions of people that have done particular art form activity, which ones have been most prominent in one year or the other. And of course, across the board, pretty much everything is up in 2021 relative to 2020. So these percentages, worth noting, is out of anyone who's attended during the pandemic, so out of that 67%. So what we can see is 97% of them have attended this year. So if you've attended the pandemic at all, you have attended this year. But some art forms, particularly live music gigs, has kind of surged up the list of ranking in terms of engagement from, it's maybe 10th up to about 5th. So, you know, as that has become more available, things like historic park or gardens, still really high, but again, it's just slightly lower than it was. It was quite clearly the single highest. It's now not. So we're starting to see a bit of a shift back. Some of the proportions for some art forms are, you know, things like opera and ballet aren't a million miles behind the typical levels in a year. So, you know, there has been some kind of rallying. Worth noting as well that people are reporting quite a lot of quite recent attendance. So, you know, almost half of people say that they've been to something in the last 2 months, which again is pretty encouraging, and getting on for a third in the last 2 weeks. This number of a third will keep coming up in different guises in terms of the proportion of the population who are either really keen, really engaged, or really resistant. So yeah, we tend to have that to keep going back to. So broadly speaking, as I said, about 2/3 of people have engaged in person during the pandemic. It's a similar proportion that have done any of the participatory activities we listed. That includes things like singing, playing music, writing, making crafts and visual arts, etc. But it does also include things like reading and visiting a library. Now, clearly, visiting a library wasn't a popular activity in 2020 as much as usual, because they were largely shut. But nonetheless, things like reading did boost substantially in the time period. So overall, we've seen a majority of people engaging in person and in participatory ways in the course of the pandemic, at least to some extent, and a reasonable chunk of people, 40%, engaging online. However, as we'll see in a sec, the balance between those has fluctuated quite wildly. The big difference, though, from last year to this year is just in that in-person engagement. The other areas have largely stayed similar, except that online engagement has tailed off somewhat. So going from 31% engaging online to 24% in 2021. And you get a similar picture where it's much lower now relative to those other activities in the last 2 months, in the last 2 weeks. That's only likely to extend as the supply of digital content also appears to be reducing. But broadly speaking, across these waves from February through June, September, October to early November, fieldwork completing, I think, the second week of November, we've seen progressively a flooding back of in-person engagement up until the beginning of the autumn, at which point everything seems to have just softened a little. So the rallying in terms of in-person engagement has kind of leveled off. The levels of online and participatory engagement also seem to have dipped. That could be a seasonal thing. It could just be as it starts getting a bit cooler, people, are maybe doing less. But nonetheless, that does seem to be what's going on. And bear in mind that all of this field work was completed before any news about the Omicron variant was mentioned. So it isn't caused by that, although of course that is a kind of confounding factor we could do with being aware of that could cut across any of these results. Okay, so we talked about in-person engagement rallying and coming back. So this is just a quick peek across at a different data source. So this is from Audience Finder, that many of you may well know, where it's showing in those yellow, blue and purple and grey bars, lines across the top, kind of the shape of a typical year, which generally speaking sort of bounces along and then dips in summer, and then it goes up for the autumn and then really high for seasonal productions. And then when we came into 2020, of course, we hit about March, middle of March, and then suddenly it plummeted, and it pretty much flatlined with a little bump last Christmas, but largely stayed very flat until finally about 5 months into this year, when it started a gradual ascent, which didn't then dip in August. It just gradually kept building and building and building. We are nonetheless, and it's that magic number again, about a third down on equivalent sales in a pre-pandemic year. Now it's worth flagging that Audience Finder as a data set is, relatively speaking, skewed towards publicly funded organisations and outside of London. I mean, there's 350 different data sources, I think, in here, so it is quite broad, quite well spread. It does contain lots of different mix of venues, but nonetheless, if you like, this is probably giving you a sharper picture of the kind of the non-London and the non-commercial sector, some of which appear to be bouncing back a little bit more robustly. If that's where we are in terms of people coming back, how are people feeling about it and what are the implications of that? So through the previous waves, from wave 2 when we first asked it, right up to September, October, when we asked people the question, if there was something you wanted to see, which of these statements best reflects how you feel about it? Are you happy to attend it? Would you consider attending it with reservations? Are you not comfortable attending it for either of two reasons? One is you need a significant reduction in risk. The other one is you want the virus effectively eliminated, or indeed, are you just not interested? So those 5 options. We pretty much saw a constant picture across those 4 waves, with a couple of minor exceptions. So largely speaking, it was pretty flat, which is odd when you think that back in February, almost no one had been vaccinated. By the time you get September, October, a huge portion of people have been vaccinated once, twice, and things were opening up more, and there was, circumstances clearly had changed, but people's attitudes largely hadn't. So people were still feeling quite kind of resistant, and a relatively small proportion, again, a third-ish, saying that they're happy to attend. In fact, a bit less than a third, just under 30%. Finally, that has started to move. I say has started to move, depending what happens with the new variant. So finally, it is a genuine third who are happy to attend. We've then got about a third who say they consider the reservations, who are kind of, if you like, in our middle hesitant group, and then another 40% who, for various different reasons, are saying they're not interested in attending. Now, we would expect these proportions to be higher for people who are interested in arts and culture, but it's really not by a lot. It's only a couple of percentage points different, sort of bumped towards being positive to attend. Because I guess when we talk about reservations about COVID and the hesitancy around COVID, it's such a big cross-cutting thing that it transcends the details of arts engagement and becomes just about where are you in your life, how do you feel about everything. And so it is quite independent of general arts engagement. Which means when we look at those sales figures before and also potentially later on, that we are looking at about a third of people who would normally come just because of COVID sort of are hesitant or not that interested in attending now, which obviously has big implications. So if people are in these kind of third of happy, unsure, and really not that keen of attending, we might sort of reasonably ask, well, is it because we're not doing enough? When people come to venues, are they broadly speaking happy? But the message we are getting back from the public is where they have attended things, then generally speaking, they are pretty happy with the safety measures that exist. So more people are very satisfied than any other ranking for everything apart from 2 categories, and there it's fairly close. And even there, they're mostly quite satisfied, particularly for things like museums, heritage, and then outdoor events. So broadly speaking, people are happy with the measures that they're experiencing. Where it's trickier, things like films, I guess, where there's potentially higher volumes of people crowded together, indoors. We can see, as we'll see in a sec, that indoors does make a big difference. But also where it's outdoors, lack of crowd control is the thing that really sticks out in terms of people's concerns. So if we look at which measures people think are important in order to feel comfortable attending, we've added in a couple of extra ones this wave. And to my great relief or pleasure, I don't know, people do rate ventilation as being most important indoors, which it is. But nonetheless, things like hand sanitizer are still, pretty high. And broadly speaking, if you look across the piece, the message we're getting from people is that pretty much anything that can be done to improve safety is important to them. So there's quite a strong message of, I guess, caution, a desire for measures to be in place. Of course, outdoors things matter a little bit less, but really not that much less, considering things like ventilation, yes, and to a lesser extent masks do drop, but largely speaking, there's a strong endorsement of the idea that safety measures, whilst people are broadly speaking happy with what they've seen, they want them. It's not something that's kind of an optional extra. And of course, as of last week, when a number of venues have now gone back to compulsory masks indoors, we may well see, this is unlikely to drift away. It's more likely to ramp up in response to the variant. So if we've looked at people, some people are happy to attend, but there is lots of concern about safety measures, even though the measures in place are pretty good. This really plays out when you think about people's attitudes to worrying about COVID. Because there's two things going on here. One is that the people who are happy to attend are much less likely to agree that they're worried about falling ill with COVID. So there's a really clear difference there, that if you're much more worried, then you're much more likely to be in the categories. But still, a third of people who say they're happy to attend say they're worried about falling ill with COVID. So it's not that we've got a group of people who are kind of carefree attenders. It's that they are happy to attend, if you like, despite the fact that quite a lot of them are worried about falling ill. Now, it's true there's a bunch of them that disagree and are not worried, and that could be for a whole host of reasons. But nonetheless, it's there even amongst our most keen to attend group. A third are worried. But when you look at the other groups, if we've got this kind of group who would consider coming, we need to bear in mind that 2/3 of them are worried about contracting COVID. So it's not, it's not a small hurdle to overcome compared to lots of the barriers we typically talk about. Fear of health is right up there. And if we do zoom in on just that group, the people who consider attending with reservations, it's not particularly they don't think the safety measures in place are any good. So their rankings are fairly similar to the overall picture. They're slightly more likely to say that they're quite satisfied rather than very satisfied. But it's not so much the measures, it's just the concern, the background worry. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted that the percentages on this chart don't add up to 100%, for which you get bonus points. But the reason is that they're totaling responses across any events people have attended. So they could have attended, one or more events. So we wanted to push this question of how people will feel about safety measures a little bit further. So we said to people, well, if you've attended and you were thinking about coming back, would you want the same level of safety measures in place? Would you want more? Would you want less? And encouragingly, most people, and it varies by art form, but not hugely, most people were saying, actually, we're happy with about the same level of safety measures. We're talking about like 50%, 60% people are saying, actually, it's fine as it is. Of the remainder, roughly 2 to 1, they would rather have more measures rather than less. So the proportion of people saying, I'd like to come back, but please can you stop all that annoying stuff, is relatively small. So the balance is in favour of people saying they want more rather than less. But overall, they're happy as it is. But we need to bear in mind those are the people that did choose to come in the first place. So there'll be other people who maybe chose not to because they weren't so comfortable. We also then said to people, well, given that the measures are unlikely to change in direct response to what they asked for, would you come back if they stayed as they were? And pretty much everyone said yes. So a very large proportion said yes. Some said, about a third said, yes, but I'd have reservations. But by and large, people will say, yeah, okay, what you're doing at the moment is fine. So I guess that's a key message. What we're doing is okay. But people are expecting this to continue to be an issue well into the future. So 6 months on, most people think it's quite likely that COVID will be affecting what we do. Indeed, pretty similar a year's time. Even in 2 years' time, a majority of people are saying they think it's quite likely that it'll be having an effect on behaviours. And if you think that by then will be almost 4 years since, if you like, previous normal attending, we can expect that changes to behaviour and attitudes and audience profile and things will have become relatively entrenched. So even once everything goes away, we might expect that actually there'll be some kind of legacy impact. So let's think about that future attendance. We asked people, do you expect to attend more or less in future, or about the same as you did pre-COVID? And pretty much across the board, overall, people said they expect to attend less. So we asked it for a range of different activities. You can see listed here at the top: film, live performance, indoor galleries and museums, outdoor heritage and parks. And those little bars right on the left-hand side summarize, in a very tiny way, the whole big picture. And largely, for most things, people expect to attend less. It's most acute for sitting down events, so to speak. And it's the opposite picture once you're outdoors. But that's the broad trend. But within that, there are some really big differences, which will have implications, I think, in terms of the shape of audiences to come. Not big differences by gender. Maybe a little bit more contrast amongst female respondents. But when we look at age, we see a really big split, and a split as well that kind of pivots at an age, 45, that we know from various other research is quite a key moment in terms of the life cycle of arts attenders. At least at the moment, there seems to be very much a kind of split in terms of tastes and preferences and engagement that happens at around that point. So the fact that we've got this reinforcing that picture suggests that we're looking at more younger audiences and saying they're likely to attend more in future, but older audiences much less. So that could be quite a big pivot. Not unconnected to that, because the ethnicity profile of the UK population is linked to age quite strongly. Fewer older audiences also means probably proportionately fewer white audiences. And we can see there are some particular instances where there looks like there could be growth in particular other audiences. So, for example, Black British audiences likely to go up, things like film, live performance, and yeah, lots of those outdoor activities are fairly across the board as well. Less difference by disability than perhaps one might expect. But the other big factor that's really jumped out during our research has been the impact of families in terms of engagement during COVID, both in terms of how fast people were willing to come back, people's attitudes to the future, the amount of risk people have felt exposed to. And we can see here that those with children are expecting to attend more, everyone else is expecting to attend less. But we can also break that down by age and see that the age of the children really makes a difference. So by and large, children under 10 makes a big positive difference. 11 to 15, yes, they might attend more outdoors, but we're expecting to attend a little bit less, if anything. It's quite small margins here, but for indoor events. And by the time you get to a sort of having a mid-teenager, they pass their GCSEs, etc., you're sort of back to normal. You're sort of like back to being a normal civilian without all the parental disruptions that affect behaviour. And we can see that played into a combination of that and the age picture we saw into the occupational differences. So we're expecting to see substantially, really quite substantially reduced attendance from people who are retired, looking after home and family, or indeed long-term sick or disabled. Notably more than the number proportion of people who actually have a disability. That's maybe striking, and again suggests a bit of a shift towards this younger, for example, more of a student audience there. So we're seeing those shifts, and of course those then map onto geography quite strongly, so that London really sticks out as the place where we're not expecting the same kind of downturn in audiences, and to some extent the Midlands, but lots of the other parts of the country, expecting quite big reductions. Again, it does vary on the type of activity. So depending on the kind of organisation you work for, that may be more or less relevant to you. But it's particularly likely to go down in the rural areas. And not unconnected with that is also likely to go down in the more affluent areas, so least deprived areas. And of course, that's also linked to age and accrued wealth. Okay, so given all of that, we can see that played out in terms of audience types. So what we expect for different audience groups. At the Audience Agency, we use a system called Audience Spectrum, which splits the population into 10 groups based on amount and type of cultural engagement and the types of people that do those things that live in different places. And we can see there's this group of metroculturals, the most highly engaged, because it goes from roughly highly engaged to low engaged. The most highly engaged group are really likely, or they say they're more likely to attend more rather than less. Not true so much of any of the other groups. Some of the less engaged groups who weren't necessarily attending a lot to start with are maybe less inclined to reduce. But nonetheless, we see quite a strong suggested reduction, particularly amongst some of these older groups. So home and heritage, heydays, some of the kind of groups that tend to have a higher proportion of older people. But notably, particularly for those who are based in the regions, community land culture buffs and normative dependables are really core, particularly for the kind of paid cultural activities, really core audiences for lots of the venues here in the north and elsewhere. And they're particularly, they normally engage a lot, they're particularly likely to engage less. So that's something that's going to have a bit of an impact. And we tried to group those into ones that have been consistently throughout our research, through all these different waves, behaving in kind of with commonalities. And here we can see on the right-hand side, these are the abbreviations of some of those other ones, that there's again this consistent pattern that, broadly speaking, highly engaged urban groups more likely to engage, family groups on the right-hand side are not going to reduce as much, and then some of those other groups looking to engage rather less, particularly where it's linked to age. We can then see that we've color-coded these just to draw your attention to those groupings. And yeah, this is just sort of highlight that picture. Substantial consistencies of drops across some of those groups. Of course, the big exception is the outdoor historic parks. Not only are drops less, it's that those urban areas, I guess people are expecting to attend outdoor things much more. However, it's not such a straightforward picture when we look across some of the other attributes that these groups have. So being happy to attend largely follows that picture, albeit with metroculturals really sticking out as kind of ahead of the crowd. And if you broaden that to include the would consider, it's still a pretty much similar picture. But once you start thinking about who expects to fall ill, or who's worried about falling ill rather, it's very much more varied across the groups. So this kind of consistency breaks down a bit, except that metroculturals again are relatively more likely to expect to fall ill with COVID or to be worried about it, which is partly probably about, they are one of the more sort of internationally connected groups, etc. I mean, that's probably the group where COVID arrived fastest, apart from anything else. And then here, when we asked people about their attitudes to COVID, there's a very mixed picture again. So we gave people 3 options, of which we're showing 2 here as the kind of extreme cases, that we should do everything we can to reduce COVID. We should make some efforts, but not go overboard. And then we just have to accept it and live with it. And we can see that for different bits of the population, there's relatively different pictures in terms of how they feel about that. So overall, for example, that older group, heydays, who one might have expected similar to up our streets, to be a bit more exposed to the risk of COVID, are actually more likely to say, you just have to live with it, it's just one of those things. Whereas some of the other groups would be more inclined to say, actually, no, we don't think that. So experience seekers, they do think we should be doing more to reduce it and, suppress it where possible. So metroculturals in particular don't necessarily want to suppress it as much, but they do think we should be making some efforts. Because that middle case is obviously the flip side of the increase of those other two extreme cases. Okay. So where does this leave us? And before I carry on, Lise, are there any questions that we used to pick up now, or?
No, we're good to go.
Cool. Okay. So where we're at, broadly speaking, then, is that we have a big chunk of the population who still say they're not ready to attend. And because that cuts across arts engagement, that does imply this kind of potential third loss in total sales, or indeed total attender numbers, which I guess if we want to replace those people, leaves us with a choice. Because clearly, if people aren't that interested in the arts and they're really worried about COVID, we know they're not going to come. If they're fine about both, we just have to do our usual thing, do effective marketing, our 4Ps, 7Ps, or whichever way you want to define your marketing efforts. But it's the kind of the usual stuff that is our bread and butter. The challenge is these other groups. So it's whether trying to get people to engage who are fine about COVID, but not that enthused about the arts in general, or a particular art form specifically, is easier than getting people who maybe, the flip side of that, if you like. So, they're not concerned, but they are interested. And in a way, I'm sort of posing that as a question to you, except to say that if we think back to our usual audience, I referenced that we often have quite a lot of churn in a general arts audience. And actually what that means is that although we may have a particular proportion of the population engaging, there's many more people than that actually have an interest, who are potential engagers. And indeed, lots of them will drop in and out of the audience on a year-to-year basis. So we have a kind of like a core audience that are really enthusiastic, but then they're quite a big kind of hinterland. So in this version of the monitor, we asked a couple of extra questions. One was about people's which art forms they were interested in, as well as what they'd actually been to, but also things around their general taste patterns. And we'll report on all of that later. But by using this kind of how interested are you figure, we can see, for example, that for, let's say, classical music, we've got 36% of the population have said they're either quite interested or very interested in classical music, but only 7% have attended a typical year. So that suggests that even if you take that 36% and we take a third off them because we know a third of the population are a bit risky, averse about attending, we've still got quite a big pool of people, about kind of 24% of people who've said they're interested in classical music. And a similar picture would apply elsewhere. 20% of people saying they're interested to some extent in opera, and only 4% attending, and so forth. So there are potentially options within an existingly warm audience. We don't need to go too far away from the people who are already interested. And indeed, we've seen there's quite a big pool of people who are concerned but open to attending, that second third. So again, there's room there to look towards not going to the extreme cases of that broadening audience approach. So, in terms of implications of all of this, it sounds like there is a lot of caution out there in the population, even before Omicron appeared. So, there's that kind of third figure that keeps coming up, and a strong appetite for safety measures. So that doesn't mean that it's a dissatisfaction with what's in place. People like what's there, but they definitely want those kind of measures, particularly if you're talking about that kind of middle third, to reassure them. it was moving in the right direction. Whether that'll keep going, I think, is a moot question given the latest news. But we can expect that that's likely to play out into longer term differences. We've seen some of those big demographic differences in terms of expected future attendance. That also plays out in terms of willingness to attend and risk and so forth. So we would expect that shift. It's likely to lead towards younger and a different mixture of audience profiles. That's likely to be a more challenging picture outside of London. And broadly speaking, list of factors on the orange arrow, if your audience has these attributes, they're more likely to be more difficult to engage. The green arrow, they're more likely to be easier to engage. So, if you see a shift in the balance of your audience, it's likely to be along those axes. Family audiences, a key opportunity point at the moment. Similarly, in terms of audience spectrum, we would expect some segments to be keener to attend rather than others. We flagged some of those groupings already. But lots of family groups there in the middle, but there's top two, which we would want to rely on in the past, maybe a little bit less easy to secure in future. And again, a bit of a contrast between usually middle engaged, but older, more traditional home and heritage audience, likely to be much more difficult to engage in future relative to experience seekers who are kind of enthusiastic, but sometimes in the past that's been a bit trickier in terms of engagement, but it looks to be more positive. So that's a bit of a run through. I'm aware that's taken slightly longer than the 30 odd minutes I was hoping for, but do check our website for more and or ask any questions. Are there any questions now, Elise, that would be useful to pick up from the chat?